Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our lecture series on world history. Today, we will learn about the great civilization which followed the Olmec, the Maya. We will focus this lecture on the 1300 years between 400 BC and 900 AD, as this is the time between the collapse of the Olmec and the fall of the classical Mayan civilization. This is what that looks like on our timeline. In our last lecture, we ended our story around 400 BC, when the Olmec civilization collapsed and their great city of La Venta was abandoned. As I mentioned last time, the cause of this collapse is still unknown. But this collapse did not mean the end of the Olmec people. Instead, their society changed, absorbed new immigrants, and developed into a different culture. The next 600 years of history, between 350 BC and 250 AD, are known as the Epi-Olmec period. The Epi-Olmec built new settlements during this time, like Tres Zapotes or Cerro de las Mesas. And in some ways, the Epi-Olmec even surpassed their ancestors. The most significant example of that is this artifact. It is a stone stele called the Mohara Stele I. On the left side is an intricate carving of a man in a ceremonial dress. But on the right side is something even more advanced. The first example of writing in the history of Mesoamerica. And we can even decipher the date on this monument. By our calendar, it corresponds to 143 AD. Then, about 100 years later, and a little to the east of the Olmec territory, in the Yucatan Peninsula, a new culture began to rise and build great cities. These people were the Mayans. The Mayans are probably most famous for their great stone pyramid temples, built in cities like Calakmul, Chichen Itza, and Tikal. When classical Mayan civilization collapsed around 900 AD, these cities were abandoned, and the houses of the common people rotted away, because they were made out of wood and thatch and mud. But the great stone pyramids survived, even as the trees grew back and those cities became jungle again. But then, the outside world began to rediscover these places in the 19th century. Explorers found these giant stone buildings, overgrown with vegetation, and sitting all alone in the middle of the wilderness. And so began the broader world's fascination with the classical Mayan civilization. And even more exciting, there was writing carved into those great stone buildings. The Mayans were the only Native American culture to develop a full writing system. Admittedly, this system was complex and involved learning over 700 different symbols, so it was restricted to the elite, but it was a true writing system. Think about that. The idea of writing was only invented by 4 different societies in all of human history. The ancient Sumerians and Egyptians in 3000 BC, the ancient Chinese in 1300 BC, and the Mayans around 100 AD. Every writing system in the world can be traced back to those 4 origin points. According to what I've read, each symbol is called a glyph, and it represents a noun phrase or a verb phrase. Each line is 2 glyphs long, and you read from left to right and top to bottom. Then, once you come to the bottom of the 2 columns, you jump over to the top of the next 2 columns. But the Mayans did not just make carvings in stone. They also had their own type of paper and their own books. They made a special kind of bark paper from the inner bark of the amate tree, which is native to Mexico. On this slide, I have a picture of the tree on the far left and a picture of this bark paper in the middle. And on the right is an example of one of these Mayan books, which today we call the Dresden Codex. But, as I did the research for this lesson, I learned something very sad. Only 4 Mayan books still exist today. The Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the Grolier Codex. That's it. That's all that survives of an entire civilization's paper literature. The reason for this is the Spanish. After they conquered the Maya in the 1500s, Spanish officials and priests regarded their literature as worthless and evil. and they destroyed it. One of the great destroyers of Mayan culture was Bishop Diego de Landa, who wrote these words about how he burned the Mayan books. "We found a large number of books in these characters, and as they contained nothing in which were not to be seen as superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them much affliction." The Spanish destroyed over 99% of Mayan literature. All that survives are 4 short books and the stone carvings on the classical temples. So, we are missing a great deal of information about the Maya. In fact, Michael D. Coe, an anthropologist and professor at Yale, who is an expert on the Maya, has made this comparison. Our knowledge of ancient Maya thought must represent only a tiny fraction of the whole picture. For of the thousands of books in which the full extent of their learning and ritual was recorded, only 4 have survived to modern times. As though all that posterity knew of ourselves were to be based upon 3 prayer books and Pilgrim's Progress. So, our records are fragmentary, and we can still only decipher about 80% of the Mayan words. But even so, we have learned some fascinating things about them. For one thing, we know that the Mayans used a base 20 number system, rather than base 10 as we do. They probably chose 20 because that is the number of fingers and toes. The Mayans wrote their numbers with 3 symbols. A dot represented 1, a bar represented 5, and a shell symbol represented 0 and was used as a placeholder. The Mayans wrote their numbers vertically. Each row represented a power of 20 instead of a power of 10 like we use. So the bottom row represented multiples of 1, the second row represented multiples of 20, the third row represented multiples of 400, and the fourth row represented multiples of 8,000. Here are some examples of how that system worked. These are the Mayan equivalents for 806, 10,145, 2005, and 16,125. The Mayans were also good at astronomy, and they actually had 3 different calendar systems. Like all agricultural societies, the Mayans knew that the year was 365 days long. So they had a 365-day solar calendar like we do. They called this calendar the Hab. But the Mayans did not divide the year into 30-day months based on the moon. Instead, the Mayan months were 20 days long. And instead of just using their numbers, they created 20 special symbols for each day of the month. Then, they divided the year into 18 months, and each of the 18 months also had its own special symbol in Mayan writing. But of course, 18 times 20 is only 360 days. So, the Mayans added 5 special days at the end of the year. These days were considered unlucky. But the solar Hab calendar was not the only Mayan calendar. They also had a special ritual calendar called the Tzolk'in. This calendar existed because the Mayans also had a reverence for the number 13. We speculate that this is because the human body has 13 major joints: the neck, the shoulders, the elbows, the wrists, the hips, the knees, and the ankles. And if you multiply 13 by 20, you get 260, which was the number of days in the Tzolk'in calendar. This calendar may also have developed because 260 days is also the approximate length of a pregnancy, or at least the time between the first missed period and birth. But of course, 365 and 260 do not match up very well. The least common multiple for these numbers is 18,980. That means that it takes 52 years for the calendars to line up again. This means that each day can have a Hab calendar date and a Tzolk'in calendar date. And since 52 years is a good portion of a human life, you can think of this system as giving each day in your life a distinct name. The Hab date is its first name, and the Tzolk'in date is its second name. This might seem like a strange system at first, but the traditional Chinese calendar does something similar, except it does this for years instead of days. That calendar combines the 12 zodiac animals with the 5 elements. Each year gets its own element and animal, and the system repeats itself every 60 years instead of every 52 years. For example, 2018 was an Earth Dog year, but so was 1958. Of course, this system only works for a period of 52 years. If you want to keep track of longer periods of time, you need another system. And this is why the Mayans had a third calendar called the long count calendar. In this system, one day was called a kin, 20 days were a winal, the Mayan month, 18 winals were a tun, or 360 days, so a tun was very close to a solar year. 20 tun were called a kattun, or 7,200 days, and 20 kattun were a ba'aktun, or 144,000 days, which is about 394 years. Now, the Mayans believed that the Earth was created on August 11th, 3114 BC. This meant that the first Baktun was completed on November 13th, 2720 BC. The second Baktun was completed on February 16th, 2325 BC. The third Baktun was completed on May 21st, 1931 BC, and so on. If you look carefully at the calendar, you can see that the 12th Baktun was completed on September 18th, 1618 AD, and the 13th Baktun was completed just a few years ago on December 21st, 2012. This was also the first day of winter that year. Because the Mayans have a special reverence for the number 13, that date was very special for them. This is similar to how the whole world had a special celebration on January 1st, 2000. Now, I created this lesson in the year 2018, in the 8th month of that year, on the 30th day of that month. But for the classical Mayans, that same date would be the 13th Baktun, the 0th Kattun, the 5th Tun, the 13th Winal, and the 18th day since the creation of the world. But for all of their mathematical, astronomical, and literary sophistication, the Mayans were still limited by one major problem. Like the ancient Sumerians and Greeks, they were divided into different city-states. And these states were constantly at war with each other. The fragments of Mayan history that do survive are filled with tales of war, conquest, murder, alliances, peace treaties, and betrayals. The main focus for all the Mayan kings was fighting wars with other Mayan kings. They also had to conduct a foreign policy and deal with the powerful city of Teotihuacan further to the west in central Mexico. We know from temple inscriptions that Teotihuacan would sometimes meddle in internal Mayan politics, and they even organized a coup in Tikal in 378 AD. This period of great city-states with monumental stone buildings is known as the Classical Mayan period, and it lasted for over 600 years, from the 3rd century AD until the 10th century AD. But then, in the early 900s, the classical Mayan civilization ran into trouble. We think that they experienced a severe drought and a long environmental crisis that harmed the production of food. Since the Mayan kings were limited by ancient traditions and fixated upon warfare, they were unable to organize a response to this crisis. And then, in the 900s, the entire system collapsed. The population plummeted, the kings lost power, and many of the great cities were abandoned. One of those great cities is called Tonina today, and in that city there is a monument called Monument 101. On this monument we see written the very last long count date. It was carved in the year 909 AD. After that, the kings of Tonina stopped building these types of monuments, and a few decades later, the city was abandoned. But the end of the classical Mayan period did not mean the end of the Mayan people. Mayan society recovered and their population bounced back. Two of the greatest cities during this time period were Zaculeu and Mayapan. This next period of Mayan society is called the post-classic period, and it lasted another 6 centuries, from around 950 AD until 1511 AD. But then, in 1511, the Spanish arrived. Over the next 200 years, they conquered the Mayans and defeated the last independent Mayan kingdom in 1697. As we've already seen, this had a devastating impact on Mayan culture, but the diseases brought by the Spanish, like smallpox, also decimated the Mayan population. The chart on the left is for the population in central Mexico, but the situation in the Yucatan was quite similar. But although the Spanish conquest was a terrible event in Mayan history, perhaps the greatest calamity they ever faced, it did not wipe them out as a people, or a culture, or a language. The Maya survived as a people and preserved their language, which is a big reason why we can decipher their ancient writing. There are 6 million Mayan people living in the world today. In fact, the people of Mayan descent are 40% of the population of Guatemala and 60% of the inhabitants of the Yucatan Peninsula. Okay, everyone, I'm afraid we're out of time. There are many more societies and civilizations that I would like to discuss. There are the Teotihuacan people, who I only briefly mentioned a few slides ago. There are the Zapotec people, also in Mesoamerica. In South America, there's the Norte Chico culture, or the later Colima culture. And then in North America, there are people like the Hopewell culture, the Anasazi, and the culture at Poverty Point. Not to mention the Caribbean cultures like the Taino. But we have many more parts of the world that we need to discuss, so we will have to leave America behind and turn our attention back to Eurasia. I hope that this lesson has made you curious to learn more about the great civilizations and fascinating societies of the Native Americans. Please join us next time as we return to the Middle East and learn about 2 people who filled the power vacuum left by the Bronze Age collapse, the Phoenicians and the Jews. Thank you very much.